Project 2025, for some conservatives, it's a dream handbook, but for many Democrats, it's America's worst nightmare. Either way, the controversial 900-page conservative playbook has many Americans fired up. Authored by dozens of former President Trump's allies and orchestrated by the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, the controversial policy proposal has alarm bells ringing across the country. And in the wake of the project's director, Paul Dance, stepping down amid the controversy, it's time to wake up, Washington. The Democrats have called it extreme.
Let's be clear. This represents an outright attack on our children, our families, and our future.
And Trump has been trying to distance himself from it.
I don't know what the hell it is. It's Project 25. But I don't know anything about it. I don't want to know anything about it.
Officials on the project claim they do not speak for any specific candidate and will not shut the project down in Dan's absence. So why does it exist? What's it all about? And why is Project 2025 so terrifying to so many Americans? Here to break it all down is the Hill's House leadership reporter, Emily Brooks. Emily, thank you so much for joining me today. I think this is your first time on the show, so welcome. Want to jump right into it. You primarily cover House Republicans and have been closely following the controversy surrounding Project 2025. So in a nutshell, what is it?
Well, essentially, you can think of this as a policy wish list for all of conservative Washington, these outside think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and over 100 other conservative organizations that have signed on to this. So this is ideally, if there is a next conservative administration, which at this point would be the next Trump administration, they're hoping that these policies are ready to go, can be implemented. And, you know, it is not exactly created in mind with a campaign that needs to win, which is why you have the Trump campaign distancing itself from these policy proposals, because there are bits and pieces of it which are a lot more extreme and conservative than Trump wants to be.
So we've seen this very much in the headlines with Democrats trying to seize on it, some Republicans like Trump distancing himself. But the latest development in all of this is that Paul Dance stepped down as the project's director. So why did he step down, or do we have any reason yet as to why he stepped down? And what does this mean for the agenda going forward?
Well, the Heritage Foundation's president, Kevin Roberts, said in a statement, sort of indicated that his stepping down coincided with a logical endpoint of part of Project 2025, the part where they were actually drafting policies and getting them ready. Allegedly, that's what happened. However, you know, this does come in the context of the Trump campaign really pushing back on Project 2025. Paul Dance himself, you know, he was seen as a link to the Trump administration. He was formerly chief of staff in the Office of Personnel Management in the Trump administration beforehand. And so, you know, his stepping down from the project sort of takes away a little bit of that credibility that it had built up being sort of a Trumpian type of project.
So, you know, I've chatted with a number of Republican sources who have sort of exhibited frustration that this was released so close to the election day. So why did the Heritage Foundation try to do this ahead of the general election? We know that the GOP is trying to win over swing voters. So are Democrats. But, you know, why would they do this if they're trying to appeal to that swing independent voting bloc?
Well, I think you have to think about the different incentives that an outside conservative organization like the Heritage Foundation and their allies would have versus a campaign. Now, the Heritage Foundation is not tasked with winning over voters in swing districts. They are trying to push and advance conservative policy, make it as conservative as possible, really getting prepared and anticipating the next administration in which they might be able to do that. And so this has been in the works for years. And that policy playbook and presidential transition project, you know, another reason why they say they created this is it's not only the policy perspective of it, but they also have a big database and cadre of individuals who could potentially staff a Trump administration. You might remember in the last administration, there were a lot of issues about being able to find enough people to staff it. So these are individuals that they think would be ready to go and start in the next administration.
So you and I, we work in politics and media. We're talking about Project 2025. We know that here in Washington, it's a big topic of conversations and political campaigns. It is as well. But how is this playing outside of Washington? A lot of Republicans I've chatted with have said, yeah, we might be worried about it, but we don't think this is essentially top of voters' minds when they're thinking about casting their vote.
You know, I've heard that from Republicans too. However, I will say that this has certainly exited the Washington bubble. You have seen search interest in Project 2025. About a month ago, it exceeded search interest in Taylor Swift. It has gone viral on TikTok. You've seen celebrities like Lizzo posting on TikTok about Project 2025. So it's really taken over a life of its own. And even polls are showing that voters are aware when you say Project 2025, they're thinking of this scary type of conservative policies, and it shows that the Democratic Party has been pretty effective in using it as a tactic to define their opponents.
I did not know that about the exceeding Taylor Swift and search interest. That's very interesting, and it might seem trivial, but that's actually pretty remarkable, and how people get their information and such. So I've been covering a number of Democratic rallies with Harris and her surrogates, her potential Veep stakes contenders, and we know that her and President Biden have both worked to tie Trump to Project 2025, as well as JD Vance, and a number of these potential VP contenders have included it in their messaging as well. So are these attacks proving to be effective? I mean, from your last answer, it seems like they are.
Yeah, certainly you are seeing that interest ticking up. It's breaking out. And also, I think the Trump administration's response to Project 2025 shows that the Democrats are being effective. Trump himself is distancing himself from Project 2025. His campaign is saying that it's a pain in the you-know-what, and it is really, something that they wouldn't even really think about. You don't often hear a presidential campaign talk about a list of policy priorities from a think tank that people wrote down in a 900-page document white paper, right? So that really wouldn't be happening if not for the Democratic attacks, and those attacks proving to be effective.
So finally, I just want to dive into some of the policy proposals that are included in Project 2025. Which policies in the agenda are eliciting the most backlash? I mean, I hear Democrats talking about reproductive rights, for example, quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is one area in which the Trump campaign and Project 2025 differ. Project 2025 goes a lot further than Trump wants to, for example, in rescinding FDA approval of mifepristone, the abortion pill. But they do overlap in a lot of areas, such as on beefing up deportations and border enforcement. But, there are a lot of proposals in this conservative wish list. They include essentially eliminating the Department of Education. There are also things that would make it a lot easier to fire federal workers. Really, every area of the federal government in this 900-plus page policy book goes department by department and suggests ways in which they can make it as conservative as possible.
It's a lot to dig through, and definitely a lot of different messages coming out on the agenda. Emily Brooks, thank you so much for stopping by to break it all down for us.
Thank you so much.
It's officially less than 100 days until the presidential election, and it has certainly been a bumpy ride up until this moment. Now, with Kamala Harris taking over the ticket as the presumptive Democratic nominee, Republicans are scrambling to make sense of their new contender. Trump's message of unity lasted mere days, quickly hitting the campaign trail and the media circuit, launching attacks on his new challenger. And as the polling continues to flow in, Harris rides a wave of positive reception, clearly clearing out gains the former president held in battleground states. Here to go on the record is Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science for Decision Desk HQ. Scott, let's jump right into the Veep stakes conversation. Vice President Kamala Harris is gearing up for the chance to become the first female president of the United States, but according to a New Times and Say 24 survey, the number of Americans ready for a female president has dropped 9 points since 2015. Now, Scott, the majority of the top contenders for Kamala Harris's vice presidential pick are men. We know that Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer has been floated as a potential pick, but she says she wants to stay in Michigan, be a governor, and be an ally to a Harris campaign and potentially a Harris administration. But do you think polling like this from that poll plays a major role in the vice president's pick of the person who, in a way, sort of replaces her?
Yeah, no, look, these are the types of polls that no campaign wants to admit they're reading in the back, and they're probably pulling on themselves. Especially given how crazy this election cycle has been. This VP pick is going to be a little bit more consequential both for the news cycle as well as for the electoral politics of the campaign. So this means a lot. I think it's something the campaign's looking closely at.
So we're seeing new polling continuing to filter in between Vice President Harris and former President Trump. So what's the latest Decision Desk HQ forecasting in some of these swing states? We had a big poll from the Hill and Emerson College last week showing Harris starting to narrow the gap that existed between former President Trump and President Biden. Yeah,
so we've had just shy of 20 polls post-Biden dropout. The vast majority of those are national polls. And at the national level, Harris is polling a little bit better than Joe Biden was. Now, the catch is she's still not ahead of Donald Trump. She's still a point or two behind. That's better than the 3.5 points that Joe Biden was behind. So that's good. In the battleground states, the key ones that we've been always talking about, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, there's only been a few polls out of there, but Pennsylvania certainly looks a little bit closer based off the two polls we got out of there. Michigan looks a little bit better for Harris. In Wisconsin, we haven't gotten a lot out, but I'm hoping to see one this week. But bottom line is Harris, doing much better than Joe Biden, but still behind Donald Trump.
We know that any VP selection is all about balancing the ticket. Harris comes from a very liberal state of California, so I guess conventional wisdom would say it would make sense that she looks to someone like a Shapiro in Pennsylvania or even a Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona. Those two are said to be leading the Veep stakes, and while these two men have outside appeal of the Democratic Party, obviously they won in swing states, appealed to some Republican voters. Shapiro has worked across the aisle a number of times with Republicans in the PA state legislature. Their critics say they are at risk of alienating the progressive and union flanks of the party. How much do you think Harris is taking that into consideration?
I think she's taking that quite a bit. We just look at all the picks. You mentioned Mark Kelly, you mentioned Josh Shapiro. I mean, Roy Cooper just the other day removed himself from the running. We're hearing a lot about Pete Buttigieg. There's a specific profile which she's looking for, and it's mostly, I don't know that she would admit it, to moderate some of her California more democratic liberal profile, and that's smart. Look, these races are run in the center right, center left, not on the extremes. And so a pick like we're talking about, like a Mark Kelly or a Josh Shapiro specifically in Pennsylvania, a Mark Kelly from Arizona, those are two states that are battlegrounds she needs to win. So picking some pretty good moderating candidates or not opposites, but certainly a little bit different of a political profile than hers is a good balance.
So we know that a ton of eyes have been on Shapiro and Kelly, but one dark horse pick that has emerged is Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota. He has sort of coined this messaging for Democrats and Kamala Harris of labeling their Republican opponents as weird, getting a lot of traction online in the news. But his critics say he may be too liberal for the ticket. So on the flip side of Shapiro and Kelly, does someone like Tim Walz risk alienating more moderate voters?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. As a former Minnesotan myself, Minnesota has tended to go more Democratic. Tim Walz seems to be, especially when he was in Congress, seemed to be a little bit more to the left than Minnesota as a whole. The Trump campaign thinks that they can play in Minnesota, which I think is interesting. Look, Tim Walz, good candidate, good campaigner, obviously a rising star, but he is significantly more progressive than, say, the Josh Shapiro, Mark Kelly we talked about before. So, I think he's making a run at it, but I think the campaign's going to go a little bit someone more center left than Tim Walz.
So another name that has been floated and really gaining a lot more traction increasingly in the news media and also online is Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. He seems to be replicating that 2020 media strategy of literally going everywhere. In fact, over the weekend, he was on Fox News Sunday, then went on MSNBC and sat down with former White House press secretary under President Biden, Jen Psaki. Do you think this is a good way to audition to be running mates, showing that you can appeal to different audiences while at the same time, ultimately appealing to different groups of voters?
Yeah, look, not only that, the Jen Psaki, he's one of the few administration officials that occasionally goes on Fox News, and he appears to be doing pretty well at it. I'm surprised it took us this long in the VP cycle. I say long, it's only been about a week. But his name came on, it was late. He wasn't in the initial batch, and he's certainly doing the rounds. Look, he's a tough pick because Indiana is not necessarily in play. He's got a record he's going to have to defend as the Secretary of Transportation. He's a little bit younger, but his TV appearances are good, especially considering this is going to be a TV media clip, TikTok clip type of an election.
Yeah, definitely. And we see his online allies really out in force on X, TikTok, Instagram, the works. So, earlier this week, Pete Buttigieg also appeared on a call along with Tim Walz and a number of other prominent Democrats, and that call was called the White Dudes for Harris on Zoom. This followed the White Women for Harris, the Black Women Win call for Harris, and then I believe Gen Z held a similar call. How much of a chance does Harris have at peeling off white male voters in particular? We know that this is a demographic that has leaned more and more towards Trump over the last 8 years or so. But at the same time, we're seeing Harris looking at all of these white men to be her running mate. So does she have a chance with this demographic?
It's interesting. She certainly got a fresher chance than Joe Biden does or did. Joe Biden did pretty well with that segment in 2020. But as you pointed out, the Democrats have been seeding that segment quite a bit. And as much as we like to talk about it, white males make up a huge majority of, not huge majority, but a huge segment of the electorate. So even moving that segment 5 or 10 points one way is going to have a pretty big impact, especially in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Look, she's got to do a little bit better in that segment than Joe Biden was trending. So that's where some of these picks are interesting. I found it interesting who all the celebrities you hear on that call, the Joe Burrows, some of these venture capitalists out of Silicon Valley, those types of things. It's certainly getting some excitement. We'll see if it plays out because, Donald Trump and his pick, JD Vance is also supposed to be going after the white male segment as well. So, that is going to be a battleground the same way that we've been talking about the African-American segment, the Hispanic segment.
Yeah, and I should correct myself. You are absolutely right. Biden was able to narrow that gap with white men in 2020. Trump won them by 30 points in 2016, and then that gap was narrowed to 17 points when he went up against Joe Biden. But speaking of Republicans and appealing to white men, we know that Harris's rapid rise, taking over the Democratic presidential ticket, has caused challenges for Republicans, including Trump's vice presidential contender, J.D. Vance. In fact, at a fundraiser earlier this week, we heard J.D. Vance describe Kamala Harris's ascendancy to the top of the Democratic ticket as, quote unquote, a sucker punch. So, what issues do Republicans see the vice president as most vulnerable on? It seems like the border tops that list.
Yeah, the border. There's J.D. Vance saying the quiet part out loud. He's learning very quickly that even his offhand comments and what he thinks is a private fundraiser are not necessarily private. Look, the border, and I think we're probably going to see quite a bit of money on this in ads, especially in the Sun Belt here in the next week or so. But look, early on in Joe Biden's presidency, Kamala Harris was the unofficial, because you can't officially be a czar, the czar of the border, and she was seen visibly down there. talked about it. Now, that hasn't been the case the last couple of years, but I think the Republicans are going to have plenty of clips to show on that. And that's something they're going to go after her on, especially considering it is a top 3 issue among voters, especially in some of these swing states like Arizona and Nevada. So yeah, that is an issue to contend with. Now she's coming back. She's making women's reproductive rights, abortion, those types of things a cornerstone of her campaign, because that is an issue that Donald Trump is weak on. So there is a lot of issues both campaigns can go after each other on. It certainly changes the board, right? Because with Biden, it was economy and border, and he's too old. And now it's, interestingly enough, it's going to be a little bit more issue focused, which I think certainly changes the game a little bit, as long as we stop talking about couches and weirdness and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the internet discourse is interesting to say the least these days. But want to get back to polling. New surveys show Harris has made a significant jump in her favorability rating. Where do those numbers sit now, and how do they compare to Trump and JD Vance? I mean, Scott, it just feels like she's very popular at the moment as she's gaining traction online, introducing herself to voters. But you have the Trump campaign essentially saying this is just a sugar high or a Harris honeymoon.
Yeah, look, I think a sugar high or Harris honeymoon, those things are an accurate depiction of how good her numbers are. Now the question is does the honeymoon last 100 days? Because that's how far we are from the election. Or does it last 45 days? Because that's when early voting starts in some of these states. Look, let's point out her favorability rating. There's been some very, very good polls for her in the last couple of days where her favorability rating has jumped up as she's gotten more media and press attention. Now she's still underwater, as is Trump, but her net unfavorability is only about 6 points in our average, I believe, as of this morning, unless there's been some new polls. And Donald Trump's has been sitting at about negative 8 to -9. And so she is doing much better than Biden, who was -14. So these are the numbers that are good for her. Now, we don't elect presidential candidates on favorability, but those are good canaries in the coal mine for how we might see some of this polling work down in some of these individual states. If I were the Harris campaign, I'd feel very good about the last week. And I'd feel a little bit of nervousness over the next month, because the Donald Trump campaign is certainly going to spend money and spend time going after her, going after those numbers.
So you referenced these attacks a little bit earlier, but Republicans are struggling to fend off attacks on JD Vance. He's had a few arguably awkward moments in the press. Obviously, those childless cat lady comments from 2021 coming back to haunt him this year. Are there serious concerns among the party about his place on the GOP ticket? I mean, his honeymoon appeared to last, a week during the GOP convention. And then Harris, the shakeup on the Democratic side happened, and it seems like it's been sort of downhill for him.
Yeah, his press has not been, at least nationally, has not been very good. Social media has had a fun time with a lot of his clips and past sayings. At the national level, you're hearing some Trump leaks about, would they have picked someone else had they know that Joe Biden was going to step aside? Those are not the stories you want a week later, especially given, JD Vance's background and story and supposed appeal to some of these segments. So yeah, no, this is in contrast not being a good week for the VP pick on the Republican side.
So I want to move to some of those comments that I mentioned before, his childless cat lady comments, all of this, I guess opposition research and these past clips, they're coming back to haunt him. He's been on the defense. How does he essentially respond to those, or how do Republicans have a chance to respond to those and turn this over on, Democrats?
So he's got an interesting strategy to respond to those, right? I think I saw the quote when they asked about the childless cat ladies. He said he didn't have anything against cats. Now that's a strategy. I don't know that necessarily that's going to play well with the female segment the Republicans need to do better with. He's certainly going to try, but that is his style, right? And when he was in the Senate and when he was coming up, he had a little bit of a fiery style like that. From a strategic standpoint, I think the campaign is going to try and push his bio, not necessarily his personality. But we'll see how that plays out, because it seems to me, at least this first week in the spotlight, he's had some moments where, if you could take them back, you probably want to send them in front of a camera.
Well, it's interesting because that, those comments about the family unit, he made those comments in 2021 talking about single women. But, at the same time, you had Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin talking about defending the American family, but he did it in a way that, didn't seem to offend as many people. So maybe a lesson learned there. Scott, before I let you go, what does the Decision Desk forecasting show for the presidential election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump? I know we're getting a lot of new fundraising and polls in.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We are still dark, at least for the next week or so, as we get a little bit more data. But I was playing around with it last night. And interestingly enough, with some of the Harris polling and some of the fundraising numbers, if we were to launch the model here in the next week or so with the data we have, it would probably be pretty close to 50-50, which is an improvement from where it was when it was Joe Biden, when Donald Trump had about a 60% chance of winning. I know those seems like small movements, but this is a very close campaign, so these small movements mean a lot.
Absolutely. And we'll see if there's any major developments in the news cycle or major movements in the news cycle between now and the next time we chat. Certainly not a shortage of topics to go over. Scott Tranter, as always, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week and be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel.